For those people, first off, who have no idea who the hell I am, I'm the guy who was behind the revelations of global mass surveillance in 2013. I worked for the CIA, I worked for the NSA as a contractor at the NSA, as staff officer at the CIA. I was undercover working at embassies. And I talk about the difference between this in a book and contractor and government official and how it's all sort of lost its meaning. But I saw something wrong, and I saw basically the government was violating the law and what I believe to be the Constitution of the United States and more broadly human rights for everyone in the United States and around the world. There were domestic surveillance programs, there were mass surveillance programs that worked internationally. Basically everything that they could monitor, they were monitoring. And this is actually, like, people go, well, isn't that obvious? Isn't that what they're supposed to do? And this is weird, but the answer actually is no. Under the framework of our Constitution, the government is only supposed to be monitoring people that it has an individualized, particularized suspicion of wrongdoing for, right? We think about this in the investigative means, right? Like all those TV shows where they're like, go and get a warrant. The reason they have to do that, like we fought a revolution over this, a couple hundred years back, is the idea that when we had, kings, when we had governments of absolute power, they could simply go in your home and go, is this guy a pot smoker, get his diary, whatever it is, and just like if you find evidence of a crime, you march him off to prison and it's all good. You found evidence, they're a criminal. Or you didn't find evidence, well, no harm, no foul, you're just doing what government does. We were trying to build a better system where yes, the government has extraordinary capabilities, but it only uses them where they're necessary, right? Where they're proportionate to the threat that is presented by this person. We shouldn't be afraid of the person who's got like a baggie of weed in their dresser or something like that. That is not a threat to national security. That is not a threat to public safety. But what happened in the wake of 9/11 was a whole bunch of government officials got together behind closed doors, and this was actually led, interestingly enough, by the Vice President of the United States, Cheney. Everybody remembers that name, or hopefully can look that name up, Dick Cheney, and his personal attorney, sort of the Giuliani of Dick Cheney, a guy named David Addington. And this lawyer, David Addington, wrote a secret legal interpretation that no one else was allowed to see. It was kept in the Vice President's safe at the White House. They weren't giving this, even when they told people, and it was just a couple people in Congress. Nancy Pelosi was one of them, and a couple of these other folks. When they talked to the heads of the agency, the NSA and the CIA and the FBI and all this stuff, they told them, the White House and the Office of Legal Counsel and, the president's attorneys, all of these guys had decided this would be legal to do. But we can't tell you why. We can't show you the legal authorization for it. You just got to take our word for it. And so they did this, and this became a mass surveillance program called Stellar Wind, which they said was supposed to monitor the phone calls and internet communications, emails, and things like that of everybody in the United States and around the world who they could get access to for links to Al-Qaeda. Because if you remember, in the wake of the September 11th attacks, they were saying, we thought there could be sleeper cells of Al-Qaeda that were just, peppered all throughout the country, and they were going to spring up at any moment. Of course, like weapons of mass destruction, it just didn't exist. It was all a power grab. But on that basis, they started doing this in secret, and it was completely unconstitutional. It was completely illegal, even under the very loose requirements of the Patriot Act. But they did it for so long that they got comfortable with it, and they thought, this is a really powerful capability. What if we started using this for stuff that was other than terrorism? Because it wasn't finding any terrorists, because there weren't any terrorists in this context that they were looking for them. And the ones who, where there were terrorists, the program wasn't affected, because these were guys in Pakistan that weren't using, email and phone calls. They were getting on a, moped with their cousin, who was a courier, who was bringing a letter to his guy, who runs the food stand or whatever. But bit by bit over time, this grew and grew and grew, and there were scandals. And if you want to drill down on these later, I'll go into them. But what happened was, step by step by step, our constitutional rights were changed. And we weren't allowed to know it. We were never granted a vote on it. And even the many members of Congress, right, 535 in the United States, they were prohibited from knowing this. And instead, they told only a few select people. In the original case, there were only 8 members of Congress, called the Gang of Eight, who knew about this. Then there were the people on the intelligence committees, both in the Senate and the House, who were told about this. But they were only told partially about it. They weren't told the full scope of it. And now that they had been told about it, because they had security clearances and things like that, they weren't allowed to tell anybody else, even if they objected to it. And we had one senator, Ron Wyden, and another one, I believe, Tom Udall was the name of him, who did object to this and who wanted something to happen, but because they couldn't tell anybody that was happening, they were sort of doing these weird Lassie barks to the press, where they were like, we have grave concerns about the way these programs are being carried out. But nobody knew what they were talking about. And so journalists were like, they've got concerns. What is that, Lassie? What are you trying to say? Timmy's in well? But they were getting it wrong. They couldn't tell what was happening. And so what had happened was that we, the American people, had sort of lost our seat at the table of government. We were no longer partner to government. We had simply become subject to government. And I think everybody who's in the world today, who is aware of what's going on, whether it's under this administration, the last administration, the one before that, right? They have seen a constant kind of shift where we, the public, have less say and less influence over the policy of government. With each passing year, there's kind of a new class that's being created, a government class, and then the public civil class that are held to different standards of behavior. And when we start talking about leaking and whistleblowing, this becomes even more clear. And so what I did was I wanted to clarify that kind of Lassie bark, right? I just wanted everybody to know what was going on. I didn't want to say the government can't do this. I didn't want to say this is how you guys have to live, because that's not for me to say. But I do believe that everybody in the United States, and more broadly people in the world who are having their rights violated by a government, should have at least an understanding of how that is happening, what the authorities, sort of the policies and programs that are enabling that are, so that they can protest them, so that they can cast a vote about them, so that they can say, you know what? You guys say this is okay, but I disagree. This is not okay. I object, and I want things to change. And so I gathered evidence of what I believe to be criminal or unconstitutional activity on the part of the government. And I gave this to journalists, right? Now, I gave this to journalists under a very strict condition here, which was that they publish no story in this archive of information simply because it was interesting, right? No clickbait, not anything just because they thought it would make news, it would get them awards. They would only publish stories that they were willing to make an institutional judgment and stand behind. And this was 3 different newspapers, that it was in the public interest to know. And so then beyond that, there was additional, because if you could see sort of what I was doing here, what had happened, what had led us into this pitfall, was that the system of checks and balances that's supposed to self-regulate our government had failed. The courts had abdicated their role in policing the executive and the Congress because terrorism was such a hot argument at the time. They were worried about being criticized and blamed if something went wrong and an attack did go through. And they didn't have access to the information that the programs were ineffective, so they were just taking the government's word for it. And they didn't want to wade in. Congress, most of them didn't even know, right? And the ones who did know, it was the same thing. They were getting their pockets stuffed with money by the defense contractors that were getting rich for building these systems that were violating the rights of each of us. So they benefited by just saying nothing. And then the executive themselves, whether we're talking about Bush, right, whether we're talking about Obama, or whether we're talking about Trump now, all these guys were okay with a constantly growing surveillance state because they're the ones whose hands were on the lever at the time. They got to aim it. They got to use it. If you had a little search box in front of you, they would give you the email history and, of everybody in the United States. Anybody you want, if you could pull up their text messages. Anybody you want, if you could see anything they've ever typed into that Google search box, right? Joe, what is the worst thing you've ever typed into that search box? That lasts forever, right? And they have a record of that. They can get that from Google.